The liberation of France in August 1944 did not feel like a clean breakthrough. It felt like an explosion. After the shattering of German lines during Operation Copra, the American army surged across Normandy with a speed no planner had predicted and no logistician had prepared for. Roads clogged with fleeing enemy units collapsed into chaos. Bridges that the retreating Wehrmacht had blown turned rivers into bottlenecks. Rail lines lay twisted by Allied bombers. Ports were either ruined, mined, or still in German hands. Yet through all this disorder, the spearheads of the U.S. Army moved with the hunger of men who smelled victory on the wind. At the center of this advance was George S. Patton's Third Army, a beast of steel, tracks, and gasoline. It moved like lightning, consuming every gallon of fuel it could reach, pushing deeper into France with a ferocity that stunned even its own commanders. Tanks of the 4th Armored Division raced 80 miles in a single day. Recon jeeps leapt ahead of the line, capturing bridges before German sappers could destroy them. Infantry moved so fast that entire units lost contact with their rear echelons. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if Patton's army might roll straight to the German border without stopping. But then the gasoline ran out. The moment came not with drama, but with silence. A Sherman tank, then a dozen, then entire companies simply stopped in the middle of the road. Engines sputtered, coughed, and died. Trucks were parked haphazardly on the shoulders, their fuel cans empty. Officers cursed. Mechanics kicked at dry gas caps, and tank crews sat on their turrets staring at the dust settling on a battlefield gone still. Patton had outrun his own war. The Third Army was more than 200 kilometers ahead of its supply depots. The French railroads were destroyed. The ports of Brittany were either ruined or still contested. Cherbourg was operating at only a fraction of capacity. And the gasoline needed to feed hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles, gasoline that traveled by ship from the United States, was bottled up in depots near the Normandy beaches. To get that fuel to Patton's tanks, it would need to move by truck. But not a few trucks. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. Tons of ammunition. Tons of rations. Tons of spare parts. Radio batteries. Engine oil. Bandages. Mortar rounds. Machine gun belts. Rifle crates, and the million tiny things that keep an army alive and moving. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton met in heated conferences, each arguing for priority. Patton, his temper flaring, insisted that if he had fuel, he could end the war before Christmas. Bradley warned that Hodge's First Army needed supplies just as desperately as they pushed toward Belgium. Eisenhower listened, balancing egos against strategic reality, knowing the Allied advance was in danger of grinding to a halt across the entire front unless a miracle of logistics appeared. And that miracle had to come fast. On the ground, the logistical officers saw the truth with brutal clarity. Conventional supply lines had collapsed. France's railroads were demolished. Horse-drawn German wagons clogged roads that Allied engineers had not yet cleared. Fuel depots were too far behind. The great ports, Antwerp, Le Havre, were not yet operational. And Patton's tanks without gasoline were little more than steel statues waiting to be destroyed by the reorganizing German forces. Something had to be created from nothing. Something impossible. The idea came from U.S. Army Transportation Corps officers who studied the few workable roads between the Normandy depots and the forward armies. What if those roads were turned into a single-purpose artery, a supply route with absolute priority? No civilian traffic, no opposing flow, no delays. Trucks only, day and night. A highway of gasoline, ammunition, and food. A racing bloodstream to feed the front. Eisenhower approved it immediately. Bradley refined it. Logistics officers mapped it. Transportation units began pulling vehicles and drivers from any available source. Quartermaster companies, ordnance units, artillery trains, even African-American service battalions who had been relegated to lesser duties but were now urgently needed. The planners gave the new supply route a code name borrowed from fast freight railroads, a name that meant speed, a name that meant clear the tracks we're coming through. Red Ball Express. Overnight, the Army began marking signs with a bright red circle, Red Ball. They erected checkpoints, one-way lanes, bypasses, and emergency repair depots. Mechanics were assigned to road stations every 20 miles. Ammunition dumps near Sanlo filled with jerry cans and crates. Commanders pushed aside regulations, simplified paperwork, suspended limits, anything to move fuel forward. Patton learned of the Red Ball Express before it even officially opened, and the moment he did, he demanded every drop possible. His tanks were still stranded. German forces were regrouping along the Moselle River and Meuse rivers. Every hour lost gave the enemy time to dig in. Every hour without fuel made his momentum bleed away. But now, finally, there was hope. On dawn August 25, 1944, the first convoys of the Red Ball Express rolled out. They rumbled down the dust-choked roads, engines roaring, tires hammering the earth. Behind them followed more trucks, dozens, hundreds. Soon there would be thousands. An hidden army on wheels, an army with no guns, no armor, but a mission just as critical as any combat division. And as the first GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks disappeared into the rising French sun, carrying the fuel Patton needed to push another 400 kilometers into the heart of Europe, the men who watched them go did not yet know that this improvised highway would become the single greatest supply operation of the war. They did not know that Eisenhower would later say, "We could not have moved without the Red Ball Express." All they knew was this: the tanks needed gasoline, and every hour without fuel made their momentum bleed away. But now, finally, there was hope. It began with dust, thick, choking, blinding dust that rolled across the narrow Norman roads as the first convoys gathered before sunrise, their engines rumbling like a distant storm. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially came to life, not as a carefully engineered logistical plan, but as a desperate improvisation born from crisis. And like all things created in crisis, it started raw, chaotic, and impossibly ambitious. The order was simple: move. Move fuel, move ammunition, move rations, move spare parts, move everything the front needed to keep fighting. No delays, no excuses, no stopping. To achieve that, the Transportation Corps did something unheard of in modern warfare. They carved two dedicated highways across northern France, one for outbound loaded trucks, one for returning empty vehicles. These routes, marked by bright red circles painted on signboards, barns, mileposts, trees, even wrecked German vehicles, became the arteries of the Allied advance. The red circle meant one thing: absolute priority. Civilian vehicles were banned. Stragglers were pulled off the road. Military police with white helmets stood at intersections, holding up stop signs that might as well have been royal scepters. When a Red Ball convoy thundered through, everything else yielded. More than 6,000 trucks were assigned to the route within its first days, mostly GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks and Dodge WC-51 3/4-ton weapons carriers. They formed into convoys of 40 to 60 vehicles, each spaced so close that the men joked they didn't need maps. They just followed the dust cloud ahead. Every convoy was supposed to run at 25 to 35 miles per hour, and they were forbidden to stop unless the vehicle was on fire or the driver was dead. Most trucks carried 5 steel 55-gallon drums of fuel, their sides clattering against the wooden bed as the vehicles bounced across war-torn roads. Others carried ammunition crates stacked to the roof, ration boxes, tank tracks, spare radios, engine parts, blankets, medical supplies, anything the frontline divisions needed. And the men behind the wheel? They were mostly young, mostly undertrained, and 75% of them were African-American soldiers assigned from quartermaster units that had never expected to become the beating heart of the Allied advance. Many had been told they would do nothing more than drive supplies in the rear. Instead, they were now responsible for sustaining Patton's tanks, Hodge's infantry, and the entire Allied spearhead plunging toward Germany. They drove through nights that never seemed to end, eyes burning from fatigue, hands blistered from gripping the wheel.
Some smeared axle grease under their eyes, like football players, to cut the glare of headlights bouncing off dust. Others tied rags around their mouths to keep from inhaling powdered dirt until their throats bled. They slept in shifts, curled across truck seats or underneath their vehicles, boots still on, bodies shaking from exhaustion. The roads themselves were battles. Rain turned them into mud traps. Heat baked them into cracked, rutted scars. Craters from old artillery shells jarred the trucks so violently that drivers sometimes bit through their own tongues. When traffic jammed, as it often did, the entire supply line snarled, miles of trucks idling helplessly until MPs cleared the blockage. Then there was the enemy. Though German firepower was diminishing, pockets of resistance remained. Snipers firing from tree lines, machine guns opening from barns, abandoned mines hidden beneath the dust. A single MG-42 burst could tear through a line of fuel trucks like a lit match in a field of gasoline. Convoys learned to move fast, stay together, and never hesitate. In the dark, headlights were hooded to slits to avoid drawing Luftwaffe attention. The night sky glowed faintly from the muffled lamps of hundreds of trucks crawling across France like fireflies trapped in jars. For drivers, night convoys felt like drifting through a half-dream, the world reduced to the dim red taillight of the truck ahead and the rumble of engines beneath their feet. Yet even amid the exhaustion, moments of strange camaraderie emerged. Drivers shared cigarettes from cargo rations, passed canteens from vehicle to vehicle, and played harmonicas leaning out of cab windows. Some sang to keep themselves awake, deep gospel hymns, scratchy blues melodies, or simply the rhythmic call and response chants that synchronized their minds with the road. They began to call themselves road warriors, tarmac soldiers, the rolling army. The officers saw them differently. To commanders reading daily tonnage reports, these men were the numbers that mattered most. 5,000 or more tons of supplies delivered every single day. To them, the Red Ball Express was less an improvisation, more a miracle that kept the Allied front from starving of fuel. But the truth? The gritty, bone-tired truth belonged to the drivers. There were days when the temperature in the cab reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Days when the trucks broke down so often that drivers learned to replace clutches, patch hoses, and swap tires by instinct alone. Days when men went 20 hours without sleep, surviving only on coffee, chocolate, and adrenaline. And yet, they kept moving. The pressure from command was relentless. Patton's Third Army was still stalled in places, tanks waiting, trucks empty, artillery quiet. Patton himself was pacing, cursing, demanding fuel. He didn't care where it came from. He didn't care what it took. He wanted gasoline, and the Red Ball Express was the only thing that could deliver it. As August turned into September, the system expanded rapidly. More trucks joined, more depots formed, more lanes were cleared. French civilians watched the convoys roll through like a metal river, endless and roaring, carrying the lifeblood of the liberation. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamorous, and it didn't make headlines. No medals were given for driving a truck through France. Yet those who witnessed it, those who lived it, understood the truth. An army cannot march without fuel. A tank cannot fight without gasoline. A front cannot advance without its lifeline. And in the late summer of 1944, that lifeline was not a glamorous division of tanks or paratroopers. It was a force of weary men behind the wheels of battered trucks, an hidden army on wheels. And soon, they would change the course of the war.
By the first week of September 1944, the Red Ball Express had grown into something monstrous, an unbroken mechanical river that stretched from the depots near the Normandy beaches all the way to the hungry mouths of the Third and First Armies thundering toward eastern France. 6,000 trucks, hundreds of jeeps and wreckers, motorcycle MPs, roving maintenance units,
Fuel tenders and recovery teams moved like a giant metal bloodstream, pumping life into the front line 24 hours a day. Nothing on wheels had ever moved like this. Not in Europe, not in any war, not in human history. And the sound of it was unforgettable. At night, when the roads turned black and the horizon disappeared into cloud and dust, the convoys came alive. Headlights hooded to slits glowed like dim, angry eyes. Engines growled in a low, ceaseless rumble that vibrated through the ground. Drivers spoke of hearing the Red Ball Express before they saw it, a distant thunder that rolled through the countryside, growing louder until the sky itself seemed to tremble. Inside this midnight storm were the men, mostly African-American drivers from QM truck companies, fighting exhaustion with coffee so bitter it tasted like metal, with songs, jokes, or simply by slapping their faces to stay awake. They drove with one rule: never stop moving. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road. If a tire blew, it was changed in under 2 minutes. If the engine died, the truck was gutted for parts, and the driver was moved to another vehicle. The route tolerated no weakness, no delays, no pauses. The front needed fuel, and the Red Ball Express existed for only one purpose: to deliver it. A single convoy typically consisted of 40 to 60 trucks, each carrying either jerry cans, 55-gallon drums, ammunition crates, or ration boxes stacked to the rails. The trucks departed the Saint-Lô and Isigny areas in staggered waves, spaced just minutes apart. It wasn't uncommon to see one convoy still roaring past a village while another was lining up behind it, and a third was already approaching from the rear. Hundreds of tons of supplies moving like synchronized machinery. The numbers were staggering. From 25 August to 16 November 1944, Red Ball convoys carried over 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations, an amount nearly equal to the total monthly consumption of the entire British Expeditionary Force in World War I. On peak days, the system moved over 12,000 tons. Ordinary roads, narrow French farm lanes, centuries-old cart paths now carried more daily tonnage than some major American highways. But the price was brutal. Road conditions deteriorated into nightmares. Dust clouds rose so thick that drivers said they could taste the earth for hours afterward. Rain transformed the roads into mud so deep it swallowed boots. Convoy wrecks became part of the landscape. Burned-out trucks, shattered axles, overturned vehicles still dripping fuel into the dirt. Some trucks blew tires on the cobblestone stretches near Chartres or Dreux. Others snapped steering rods after hitting shell craters at full speed. Mechanical failures were constant. Every 20 miles, maintenance teams waited at improvised pits, nothing more than muddy clearings filled with spare parts, tire piles, and men covered in grease. When a convoy rolled through, these mechanics worked like pit crews in a race. A truck would screech in, a dozen hands would descend, tires swapped, belts changed, radiators patched with epoxy and faith. Engines coaxed back to life, ammo and fuel resecured, and then the truck was shoved back onto the road, the convoy swallowing it whole and dragging it onward. The dangers weren't just mechanical. The enemy was still out there. Isolated German infantry units sometimes ambushed convoys, firing from hedgerows or abandoned farmhouses. Snipers harassed the Red Ball at night. Sporadic Luftwaffe aircraft dive-bombed sections of the route during early September, forcing drivers to scatter their trucks along ditches until the threat passed. But the greatest enemy was fatigue. Some drivers went 48 hours without proper sleep. Men fell asleep at the wheel, waking only when their truck slammed into the embankment or clipped the back of the vehicle ahead. Others hallucinated, seeing animals on the road, hearing phantom commands, or imagining headlights where none existed. Yet the convoys kept moving, because the front was moving. Patton's Third Army was devouring fuel at rates no one had anticipated, 350,000 gallons per day at the height of the pursuit. Without the Red Ball Express, his tanks would have stalled within hours. Instead, thanks to the trucks grinding through dust and mud and darkness, Third Army advanced more than 400 kilometers in a single month one of the fastest sustained ground advances in modern military history. Every night, as Patton's armored divisions prepared for another day of battle, Red Ball drivers arrived at the forward dumps, climbing down from their cabs with eyes red from dust and exhaustion. They unloaded under the thin light of carefully shielded lamps. Jerry cans clattered onto the ground, ammunition crates thudded beside artillery pits, ration boxes were stacked into mountains outside field kitchens, fuel drums rolled down wooden ramps like thunder. Then the drivers remounted their trucks, turned their dim headlights toward the black horizon, and began the long haul back to Normandy to reload. Behind them, tank engines roared back to life. Artillery batteries primed their guns. Infantry units packed up for new offensives. The war moved because the trucks moved, and the trucks moved because the men inside them refused to stop moving. Day after day, night after night, mile after mile. A hidden army of engines in the dark, carrying the future of the Allied advance on their battered steel backs.
By the first days of September 1944, Patton's Third Army was a paradox, one of the fastest-moving military forces in history and one of the most fragile. It fought not with a steady drumbeat, but in lunges, devouring fuel faster than any planner had imagined possible. Patton's officers joked grimly that their general didn't command an armored army, he commanded a gasoline-burning dragon. And now, after weeks of thunderous advance, that dragon was starving. The Third Army spearhead units, 4th Armored Division, 6th Armored, 5th Infantry, and their supporting cavalry groups, had raced beyond Chartres, crossed the Seine, smashed the Falaise remnants, and carved deep into eastern France. But near the Meuse River, the line of advance broke into stuttering silence as tanks rolled to a halt. Crews sat on their Shermans and tank destroyers in fields and villages, staring helplessly at the horizon. For days in late August, the same terrifying phrase repeated across Patton's headquarters: out of fuel. Some armored battalions were down to a handful of operational vehicles. Trucks that should have carried jerry cans were stuck 200, 300 kilometers behind the vanguard. Engineers couldn't fix roads fast enough. Rail hubs were piles of twisted steel. And the Germans, though retreating, were still cohesive enough to form new defensive lines if given the chance. Patton sensed the danger instantly. Momentum was everything. If his advance stopped, the enemy would recover. If the enemy recovered, the war in the West could drag on for months. So when the first Red Ball Express convoys reached Third Army's forward supply dumps in early September, dust-caked GMCs rolling through villages like steel ghosts, Patton reacted with the fury and relief of a man who'd been drowning and finally found air. "Fuel! Get me fuel!" his quartermasters shouted as the trucks pulled in. The drivers unloaded so fast that jerry cans clattered like chains spilling from the heavens. They worked shoulder to shoulder with armored mechanics and infantrymen, passing cans hand to hand, rolling drums into pits, stacking cases of 30 and 50 caliber ammunition beside artillery batteries, preparing for the next assault. Patton, watching the first loads arrive, simply nodded. Then he issued the order that became legend: "Tell the boys they can move again." In the next 3 weeks, the effect was explosive. With the Red Ball Express sustaining them, the Third Army surged forward another 400 kilometers through September, an advance that shattered German defenses along the Moselle, liberated Reims, seized crossing points near Verdun, pressed into Lorraine, and set its sights on the fortress city of Metz. The speed was astonishing. The Third Army's official September after-action report states plainly, Red Ball Express tonnage made this advance possible. And it was not just Third Army that benefited. Hodge's First Army, the vast formation advancing from Paris toward Belgium and Aachen, relied equally on Red Ball tonnage for its artillery ammunition, infantry rations, and armored fuel. But it was Patton who pushed the limits hardest. At one point in early September, Third Army was burning nearly 350,000 gallons of fuel per day, enough to empty an entire tanker ship every week. Without Red Ball deliveries, the advance would have frozen instantly. Instead, it roared onward. German commanders were stunned by the pace. Field Marshal von Rundstedt wrote in frustration that the Americans move with a speed that defies rational planning. In reality, the speed was not magic. It was gasoline. Gasoline carried by exhausted 19-year-olds driving trucks through the night. The Red Ball convoys began arriving so close behind Patton's formations that tank crews joked the trucks were racing them. Soldiers remembered moments when they would pull into a newly seized village, only to see Red Ball Express vehicles already waiting by the roadside, engines idling, drivers slumped over their steering wheels, half asleep, but still ready to unload. These drivers, most of them African-American soldiers, were now as essential to the Third Army as its tanks. Many had never been thanked by the combat troops they supplied. Some endured discrimination even as they performed miracles. But in the dust and exhaustion of September 1944, all hierarchies vanished under the same need: move the front. Eisenhower himself grasped the significance. In mid-September, after touring Red Ball operations and reviewing Third Army's progress, he made the statement that would echo across every logistics classroom for decades: "We could not have moved without the Red Ball Express." The truth of that sentence was written on every map. Behind Patton's advance lay a single, slender, overburdened supply artery, the only thing connecting his tanks to French depots far behind. Without that artery, momentum would die. With it, the Third Army became a weapon of unstoppable motion. As September drew to a close, the weather began to turn. Rain lashed the roads, mud thickened, trucks bogged down, engines overheated, but the Red Ball Express kept rolling. It rolled through shell-pocked forests, through shattered villages, through nights so black drivers had to navigate by memory. It rolled until boots stuck to pedals, until knuckles bled, until eyes burned raw. And the Third Army kept moving. The Red Ball Express had done more than save Patton's advance. It had turned logistics into the decisive weapon of the campaign. By the time early autumn settled over France, the hidden army on wheels had become one of the greatest supply forces ever assembled. And soon, in the final chapter of its short, furious life, the Red Ball Express would secure its place in history, not as a temporary solution, but as the operation that kept the entire Western Front alive.
By mid-November 1944, the weather over northern France had turned harsh and unfriendly. Cold rain lashed the fields. Mud swallowed boots and tires alike. Convoy roads that had once been thick with dust were now slick, rutted snake paths of brown sludge. Drivers shivered under wool blankets during brief halts, breath fogging the air as they tried to stay awake long enough to make the next checkpoint. And yet, even in these brutal conditions, the Red Ball Express kept moving until finally, on 16 November 1944, the order came down from Schaeff. The operation would be shut down. Antwerp had been captured and was now being cleared for use. New supply lines were opening. The improvised miracle was no longer necessary, but its legacy was already written in sweat, gasoline, and the black exhaust trails that streaked the French sky for 83 relentless days. The end of the Red Ball Express did not come with ceremony. Convoys finished their last runs. Trucks limped back into depots covered in mud, their engines rattling from exhaustion. Drivers climbed out stiffly, some barely able to walk after weeks of 20-hour days. Mechanics wiped down their tools for the final time at the roadside pits. And as the great machine that had never slept finally wound down, a strange silence settled over the roads that had carried more than 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to fuel, feed, and arm two entire U.S. field armies during the most rapid phase of the Allied advance. In the command tents of the First and Third Armies, the impact was undeniable. The Red Ball Express had not merely supported the advance across France, it had enabled it. Every kilometer Patton's tanks traveled, every artillery barrage Hodge's infantry unleashed, every rifleman who ate, every Sherman that refueled, every wounded man who received medical supplies, each act depended on the trucks. In Third Army's September after-action report, the line appeared stark, almost clinical in its honesty. Without the Red Ball Express, the advance would have halted. The U.S. Army Center of Military History later expanded upon this truth. The logistical achievements of the summer and fall of 1944 were unprecedented, not only in scale but in speed. Never before had a modern army been fed entirely by truck convoys across a ruined continent, and never before had an improvised supply network risen to meet the demands of such a ferocious advance. But what made the Red Ball Express truly extraordinary were the people who operated it. More than 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers who had been relegated to service units because the segregated U.S. Army refused to place them in combat roles. With the launch of the Red Ball, they suddenly became the backbone of the European front. These men drove through sniper fire, through air raids, through nights without sleep. They repaired engines with numb fingers. They raced through blackout conditions, guided only by the faint red taillight of the truck ahead. They survived ambushes, mechanical failures, and fatigue so deep it bordered on hallucination. Many received no medals, few received recognition, and yet without them, the Allied front would have withered. In their hands, the GMC CCKW became more than a truck. It became a lifeline, a breathing, roaring conveyor belt that carried the war forward. Commanders took notice. Patton, who rarely praised anyone outside his own ranks, called the Red Ball drivers the most important men in the European theater. Eisenhower, in his memoirs, stated flatly, "We could not have moved without the Red Ball Express." That sentence would become famous. It would echo in every logistics classroom, every study of World War II supply operations. But for the men who had lived the experience, the truth was simpler and harder. They had kept the front alive. The Red Ball Express lasted only 83 days, but in those 83 days, it revolutionized how armies thought about logistics. It proved that speed mattered more than perfection, that flexibility mattered more than planning, that mobility was the currency of modern war. The system influenced post-war doctrine, shaping everything from Cold War supply strategies to the development of modern highway-based military logistics. Yet for its all historical significance, the most enduring image of the Red Ball Express is not a map or a statistic, it is a moment. A long column of trucks, engines rumbling, moving through the cold night, headlights dimmed, drivers hunched forward fighting exhaustion, the red circle signs flashing by in the dark, and somewhere many kilometers ahead, Patton's tanks roaring to life again as drums of gasoline thudded onto the ground beside them. The front moving, the war moving, because the trucks moved. When historians speak of the liberation of France, they speak of Omaha, Cobra, Falaise, and the Breakout. But hitting behind those thunderous battles was an army of young men driving through dust and darkness, carrying the weight of the war on steel axles. The Red Ball Express was their creation, their burden, their triumph. And when the last convoy rolled off the road on November 16, 1944, the war in Europe was already turning toward its final act, powered by the memory of 6,000 engines roaring in the dark, an army on wheels that kept the continent of Europe moving toward liberation.